The sun was sinking low over Gallows Hill, casting long, twisted shadows over the barren land. The place had an unnatural stillness, a silence that felt thick, as if the air itself were holding its breath. Jason led the way, camera in hand, his dark hoodie pulled tight against the October chill. Behind him, the rest of the team followed, each burdened with their own thoughts as they approached the infamous hill where so many had been condemned centuries ago. "This is it," Jason said, breaking the silence as he gestured toward the top of the hill. "Gallows Hill, where they hanged the witches." Emily shuddered, pulling her coat tighter around her. She didn't need to be told what this place was. The moment they'd stepped foot on the grounds, a suffocating energy had wrapped itself around her. It wasn't just the cold, no, there was something far more sinister here. She could feel it deep in her bones, like an invisible weight pressing down on her chest. Ryan, ever the skeptic, laughed under his breath. "Witches, right. More like a bunch of scared people accusing their neighbors of nonsense. I don't get why we're here." Jason ignored him, focused on setting up their gear. "Because this place is one of the most haunted spots in America, and we're going to prove it." Ethan, the tech guy, was busy with the equipment, setting up EMF detectors and spirit boxes on the uneven ground. He was always methodical, double-checking every piece of gear. But even he felt the strangeness of this place. "You think we'll actually catch something here?" he asked, not looking up as he adjusted a camera. Jason gave him a quick nod. "If we're going to catch anything, it's going to be here." The wind picked up as the sun dipped lower, causing the dry leaves on the ground to swirl around their feet. Gallows Hill looked different in the fading light. The shadows seemed to stretch further, darker, as if the night itself was creeping closer, waiting to swallow them whole. Emily stood a little apart from the group, staring into the distance. Her fingers clenched around the EMF detector in her hand, but her mind was far from the cold device. Something was wrong. "I don't like this," she said quietly. Ryan rolled his eyes. "You never like it. Every time we go somewhere, you say the same thing." Emily didn't respond. She didn't need to. There was something here. She was sure of it. As they set up their base camp at the top of the hill, the reality of where they stood began to sink in. This was the spot where the condemned had met their fate, where the accused witches had been hanged, their bodies left to swing in the wind until death took them. The history was palpable, clinging to the air like a heavy mist. The team gathered around, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of their equipment. The hilltop was empty, devoid of life except for the brittle grass that crunched beneath their feet. But the emptiness felt deceptive. The air was too thick, too still. Jason broke the silence. "Let's start with an EMF sweep. Emily, you lead." Emily took a deep breath and began to walk slowly across the clearing, the EMF detector held out in front of her. The device was silent at first, the lights at the bottom steady and unmoving. But she could feel something just beyond the edge of her perception, watching, waiting. The wind seemed to carry whispers, just out of reach. Ryan followed behind, muttering to himself. "It's just wind. Nothing out here but old stories." Then the detector beeped. Emily froze. The sudden sound was jarring in the oppressive silence. The lights on the device had jumped from green to yellow in an instant. She stared at it, her breath catching in her throat. Jason stepped closer, eyes wide. "What did you get?" Emily didn't respond, her focus entirely on the detector. She moved it forward slowly, and again, the lights flared, jumping from yellow to red. "There's something here," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. Ryan huffed. "It's probably a loose power line or something." "There's nothing out here," Ethan replied, frowning. "No power lines, no buildings, no tech. Whatever she's picking up, it's real." Jason swung the camera back to Emily, filming as she continued her sweep. The beeping grew more intense the closer she moved to the center of the hill. The air was colder here, biting at their skin. The sun was almost gone now, leaving the world around them in shadow. Suddenly, Emily stopped dead in her tracks. Her eyes went wide, her face pale as if she'd seen something that none of them could see. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. The group went silent, straining to listen. But there was nothing, only the sound of the wind. Ryan shook his head. "You're freaking yourself out. There's nothing." "Shut up," Emily snapped, holding up a hand. "Just listen." At first, there was only silence. But then, faintly, almost like the wind itself was speaking, came the sound of whispering. It was soft, so quiet that it could have easily been dismissed as the wind. But the cadence was unmistakable. It was a voice that didn't belong to any of them. The whispering grew louder, more distinct, though the words were still impossible to make out. Emily's face drained of color as she listened, her heart pounding in her chest. "They're here," she whispered. "They're watching us." Ryan opened his mouth to argue, but even he could hear it now. The whispers weren't random. They had a rhythm, a strange, unsettling pattern. Jason stepped closer to Emily, his voice barely above a whisper. "What are they saying?" Emily shook her head. "I don't know, but they're angry." Suddenly, the EMF detector in her hand flared again, the lights flashing red, and the beeping became frantic. Emily gasped and took a step back, her eyes wide with fear. The wind picked up, swirling around them, carrying the whispers with it. It felt as though the very air was alive, filled with the voices of the dead. "We need to keep going," Jason said, though his voice wavered. He tried to hold the camera steady, but his hands were shaking. They moved deeper into the hill, the air growing colder with every step. The whispers never ceased, following them like a shadow. The EMF detector remained active, its beeping a constant reminder that they weren't alone. They reached the spot where the gallows once stood, a bare, empty space where the grass had long since withered. "This is where it happened," Jason said, his voice barely a whisper. "This is where they hanged them." Emily stared at the spot, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. She didn't need to be told. The energy here was so thick, so overwhelming, that she could barely breathe. "There's something here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Something, watching us." Before anyone could react, the spirit box crackled to life in Ethan's hand, emitting a burst of static. They jumped, startled by the sudden noise. Ethan fumbled with the device, adjusting the settings as he tried to tune in to any potential voices. For a long moment, there was nothing but static. Then, faintly, a single word came through: "Innocent." The group exchanged nervous glances, the hair on the back of their necks standing on end. The voice had been soft, distant, but unmistakable. Another word followed, clearer this time: "Betrayed." Emily's hands trembled, her knuckles white as she gripped the EMF detector. "It's them," she whispered. "The ones who were hanged. They're still here." The spirit box crackled again, and this time, a voice came through, faint but desperate. "Help us." They stood frozen, their breath caught in their throats as the words echoed through the darkness. The air around them seemed to grow even colder, the wind howling as though the very spirits of Gallows Hill were crying out. Jason turned to the camera, his face pale. "We're not alone here," he said, his voice barely audible. "Something is still here, and it wants to be heard." The whispers continued long into the night. The night settled in like a heavy shroud, swallowing the last remnants of daylight as the team huddled together on top of Gallows Hill. The earlier whispers that had echoed through the wind seemed to follow them, now hanging in the air like a lingering echo. Emily felt the weight of it all pressing down on her, an unseen force that crawled beneath her skin, making every breath feel labored. She hadn't spoken since the spirit box had uttered its chilling words. "Innocent, betrayed, help us." Jason adjusted the camera, his face lit by the eerie green glow of the night vision. He was trying to keep his composure, but his hands shook as he spoke. "All right, team, let's regroup. We've already gotten some serious evidence, voices, EMF spikes, and whatever those whispers were. We need to dig deeper into this place." Emily stood apart from the group, staring into the dark woods that surrounded the hill. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Not just by one presence, but by many. Dozens, maybe. The air was thick with it. "We should try to communicate with them again," Ethan suggested, holding the spirit box tightly in his hands, his usual confidence dimmed by the creeping fear. "We need more." Ryan, the skeptic, let out a nervous laugh. "More? More of what? More voices telling us that some poor souls were screwed over 300 years ago?" He glanced around, the bravado barely covering his growing discomfort. "This place is starting to get to all of you." Before anyone could respond, Emily's voice cut through the tension. "We're not alone. They're watching us. All of them." Ryan snorted. "Come on, Emily. You're really buying into this?" But Emily's eyes remained fixed on the woods. "I'm not buying into anything. I can feel them." Jason stepped toward her, his voice low. "What do you mean?" Emily shook her head, as though trying to dispel the oppressive feeling crawling over her. "They're angry. I don't know if they want us here. Some of them." She paused, searching for the words. They were innocent, but the anger, it's so strong. They were betrayed. A sudden gust of wind whipped across the hill, rattling the equipment and sending dry leaves swirling around their feet. The temperature dropped sharply, and a cold chill settled in their bones. Ethan checked the thermal camera in his hand and frowned. Temperature just dropped 15 degrees. That's not normal. Jason nodded. Let's see if we can get some more answers. Emily, do you think you can do a reading? Emily hesitated. She hated doing these kinds of readings, especially in places like this, where the energy was so intense it felt like wading through quicksand. But she knew she had to try. Okay, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I'll try. She knelt down in the center of the hilltop, the place where the gallows had once stood, and closed her eyes. The rest of the group watched in tense silence, the wind now barely a whisper around them. Emily reached out, her mind opening to the energies around her, allowing the voices of the past to seep in. At first, there was nothing but a heavy silence, like the deep, oppressive quiet of a tomb. Then, slowly, images began to form in her mind, faint and distant at first, but growing clearer with every passing second. She saw them, the women, men, even children, standing in the shadow of the gallows, their faces pale with terror. Some were crying, others stood in silent defiance, but all of them were marked for death. The ropes hung from the wooden beam, swaying in the wind like pendulums of doom. Then, the image shifted. Emily saw one woman in particular. She was younger than the others, with dark, intense eyes that burned with fury. Her name was Abigail Ward. Emily could feel her rage, white-hot, all-consuming, like a fire that refused to be extinguished. They lied, Emily whispered, her voice no longer entirely her own. They lied about me. Jason crouched beside her, holding the camera steady, his heart pounding. Who lied? Tell us more. The words tumbled out of Emily's mouth, sharp and bitter. He lied. John Proctor. He accused me, but it wasn't true. None of it was true. Ethan, standing a few feet away, glanced at Ryan, his face pale. She's channeling someone, he whispered. This is real. Ryan's usual bravado had faded, replaced by an uneasy silence as he stared at Emily. He didn't believe in this stuff. He never had. But seeing her like this, he couldn't deny that something was happening. Suddenly, Emily gasped, her body jerking as if she'd been struck. Her eyes flew open, wide and terrified. She's here. The words sent a cold shiver down everyone's spine. Jason stood up quickly, scanning the area with the camera, but there was nothing. Just the wind, the darkness, and the oppressive silence of Gallows Hill. Who's here? Jason asked, his voice trembling. Emily's eyes were unfocused, distant, as though she were looking at something just beyond the veil of reality. Abigail. She's still here. She never left. Before anyone could react, the EMF detector in Ethan's hand started beeping wildly, the lights flaring from green to red in rapid succession. The spirit box crackled to life once more, spitting out static until a single, chilling word emerged. Justice. Ryan took a step back, his face pale. What the hell was that? The word echoed in the night, as if the very hill itself had spoken it. Ethan looked at Jason, his voice shaking. We need to know more about Abigail Ward. There's got to be a reason she's still here. Jason nodded. You're right. We need to do some research. Maybe there's something we missed. Something about her trial or her death. They huddled together, pulling out their phones to dig through online records, desperate for any information that could help them make sense of what was happening. After a few tense minutes, Jason spoke up, his face grim. Abigail Ward, he read aloud from his phone. Accused of witchcraft in 1692. Her main accuser was John Proctor, a prominent figure during the trials. She was found guilty and hanged right here on Gallows Hill. But there's more. Some records suggest she wasn't a witch at all. She was accused because she refused to marry Proctor's son. He wanted her, and when she rejected him, he turned the town against her. That's why she's still here, Emily said, her voice soft but steady. She was betrayed. She was innocent, but they hanged her anyway. She wants justice. The group fell silent, the weight of Abigail's story settling over them like a dark cloud. Ryan, who had been the skeptic all along, was now visibly shaken. So what do we do? He asked, his voice trembling. How do we give her justice? Before anyone could answer, the ground beneath their feet seemed to tremble, ever so slightly. The wind picked up again, stronger this time, and with it came the unmistakable sound of a woman's scream, long, piercing, and filled with a rage that cut through the night like a knife. Emily clutched her chest, gasping for breath as the scream echoed through her very soul. "She's not going to stop," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Not until someone pays for what happened to her." The scream faded into the night, leaving only the howling wind in its wake. The group stood frozen, fear gripping them like a vice. They had come to Gallows Hill searching for proof of the paranormal, but now they had found something far worse: the ghost of a woman who had been wronged, and whose rage had never died. "We need to get out of here," Ryan said, his voice breaking. "We've done enough. We've seen enough." Jason shook his head, his eyes fixed on the camera. "No, we're staying. We have to finish this. We have to figure out what she wants." But deep down, they all knew the truth. Abigail didn't want anything from them. She wanted revenge, and until she got it, no one on Gallows Hill would be safe. The camera flickered as Jason took a step forward, his voice shaky but determined. "Let's keep going. We need to know what happens next." And as they turned back toward the hill, the wind whispered around them once more. The voices of the past, still echoing, still waiting for justice. The air around Gallows Hill had grown thick with tension. Every breath felt labored, as if the very ground beneath them was breathing with the spirits of the dead. Emily stood frozen in place, her face pale and her wide eyes staring into the darkness. She could feel Abigail's presence all around her, not just as a distant memory but as something powerful, something angry. And she wasn't alone. The others could feel it too. This presence wasn't going to let them leave easily. "I can't stay here," Ryan muttered, backing away from the hilltop. His voice cracked with fear, and the bravado he'd carried throughout the night was now gone. "I'm done. This is too much." Jason lowered the camera, his brow furrowed. "We can't leave yet. We're too close. We need more footage, more evidence." Ryan shook his head furiously. "You've got all the evidence you need. You heard that scream. We all did. There's something here, and it's not friendly." Ethan was busy gathering the equipment, his hands shaking as he shoved the EMF detector and spirit box into his bag. "I agree with Ryan. That wasn't just a ghost. That was something dangerous." Emily still hadn't moved. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she clutched her chest, her heart racing. The world around her felt distant, like she was trapped in a bubble of cold air and whispered voices. She could feel Abigail's presence pressing down on her, a suffocating weight that threatened to crush her. But there was more than just Abigail here. Shadows danced at the edge of her vision, figures moving just beyond the darkness, watching. "Waiting. We need to leave," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. "She doesn't want us here anymore." Jason opened his mouth to argue, but a sudden gust of wind whipped across the hill, strong enough to nearly knock him off his feet. The air crackled with energy, and for a brief moment, the temperature plummeted so low that their breath hung in the air like smoke. Then came the whispering, soft at first, barely audible, but growing louder with each passing second. It wasn't just one voice. It was many, dozens of voices, all speaking at once, overlapping in a cacophony of anger and desperation. The voices swirled around them, carried by the wind, growing louder until they filled the night with an otherworldly, haunting chorus. "They're all here," Emily said, her voice trembling. "The ones who died. They've been watching us all night." Jason turned in circles, the camera rolling, trying to catch any glimpse of what Emily was talking about. But all he saw was darkness. "Where are they?" he asked, his voice tight with fear. Emily pointed toward the woods at the edge of the hill. There, as they all turned to look, the shadows seemed to shift. At first, it was subtle, like the branches of the trees swaying in the wind. But then, as they watched, the shadows coalesced into distinct shapes. Dark, human-like figures emerged from the trees, their forms barely visible in the faint moonlight. They stood still, watching, their faces hidden in shadow. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. What the hell are those? The figures didn't move, they simply stood there, silent and unmoving, like sentinels guarding the hill. But even from this distance, the group could feel the malice radiating from them. These weren't just the spirits of the dead. They were something darker, something twisted by centuries of anger and betrayal. Jason turned to Emily. Is that Abigail?" Emily shook her head, her eyes wide with terror. "No, that's them. The others who died here. But they're not like her. They don't want justice. They want revenge." The words sent a chill down Jason's spine. The shadows were getting closer now, moving slowly toward them. their shapes becoming clearer with every step. The group began to back away, their fear growing with each passing moment. Ryan's voice broke through the rising tension. "We need to get out of here. Now." Without another word, they all turned and ran. The wind howled as they sprinted down the hill, their feet slipping on the uneven ground. The equipment clattered against their bodies as they ran, the sound drowned out by the whispers that still echoed in the air, growing louder, more frantic. As they reached the bottom of the hill, Jason glanced back over his shoulder. The figures were still there, moving steadily toward them. But it wasn't just the shadows that terrified him, it was the feeling that had settled over the hill. The energy in the air had shifted. It was no longer just eerie or unsettling. It was malevolent. They reached their van, breathless and wide-eyed, but just as Ethan reached for the door handle, the van's engine sputtered to life on its own. The headlights flickered and the radio crackled to life, spitting out static. Jason's heart pounded in his chest as the van rocked slightly, as if something, or someone, was pushing against it from the other side. "What the hell is happening?" Ryan shouted, his voice high with panic. Emily staggered backward, her hand flying to her chest. She could feel it. Abigail was close, closer than she'd ever been. And she wasn't happy. "She's not letting us leave," Emily gasped. "Abigail, she's still here." The van's doors all slammed shut at once, and the lights flickered wildly. The wind whipped around them, stronger than ever, and the shadows at the top of the hill seemed to surge forward, moving faster, as if they were being drawn toward the group by some unseen force. Jason grabbed the camera, filming the chaos as best he could. "We have to get out of here." Ethan fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking uncontrollably. I'm trying. The engine sputtered again, but it wouldn't start. The van shuddered, the windows rattling as if something was trying to break through. Ethan cursed under his breath, frantically turning the key in the ignition. Suddenly, the radio crackled again, and a voice emerged from the static. It was faint at first, but slowly grew clearer. Innocent, betrayed, justice. Emily's heart stopped. "Abigail." The voice was Abigail's. The van lurched forward, and Ethan slammed his foot on the gas. The engine roared to life, and they sped away from Gallows Hill, the shadows chasing them as the voices faded into the night. As they drove through the dark, winding roads of Salem, no one spoke. The tension in the van was thick, each of them lost in their own thoughts. The horrors of the night still clung to them, like a shadow that refused to let go. Finally, Jason broke the silence. "We're not done with this." Ryan looked at him incredulously. "Are you insane? After everything that just happened, you still want to go back?" Jason shook his head. "No, we're not going back, but we can't just walk away from this. Abigail deserves justice. We need to tell her story. We need to let people know what really happened." Emily stared out the window, the trees flashing by in the darkness. She could still feel Abigail's presence, still hear her voice in the back of her mind. She knew Jason was right. Abigail's story wasn't over, and until it was told, until justice was finally served, Gallows Hill would never be free of its ghosts. As the van sped away from the haunted hill, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they had only scratched the surface of the horrors lurking in the shadows of Salem. The spirits they had encountered tonight were only a small part of something much bigger, much darker. And whatever it wasn't finished with them yet. Thanks for watching. If you liked this chilling tale about Gallows Hill and want to hear more chilling tales, make sure that you like and subscribe.